Chapter 1. The Accident That Changed Everything. 9 million years ago, a primate reached for a fallen piece of fruit. It had no idea what it was doing, but what happened next set in motion a chain of events that would lead to wars, empires, religions, and the bottle sitting in your kitchen right now. Somewhere in a tropical forest, 9 million years ago, a primate reaches for a piece of fruit that has been lying on the ground for several days. It doesn't know that inside the fruit, microscopic organisms have been quietly devouring its sugars and releasing a byproduct of their own metabolism. It just smells something, sweet, slightly sharp, unfamiliar, and eats. Within minutes, something changes. The world feels slightly different. Movements become a little less precise. Fear becomes a little less sharp. Something clicks in that ancient nervous system, and the primate eats another piece of fruit. Then another. It has no idea what just happened. It has no idea that this substance, ethanol, will one day shape wars, religions, trading empires, and the fates of entire civilizations. That temples will be built in its honor, and it will be banned under penalty of death. That it will become currency, medicine, poison, and sacrament all at once. It is simply eating fallen fruit in a tropical forest. And somewhere far in the future, a human being opens a bottle. The story that began with that primate continues. Let's start with a question that sounds simple, but is anything but. What is alcohol, really? Where does it come from? And why does it exist at all? Because the answer changes everything you thought you knew about it. Ethanol, the molecule with the formula C2H5OH, is a byproduct of yeast metabolism. Yeast are tiny single-celled fungi that feed on sugar. When yeast consume sugar, they produce two things: carbon dioxide and ethanol. This is not their goal. It is waste. Alcohol is, quite literally, the excrement of microorganisms. Remember that fact. It will come in handy later when we talk about why humanity spent thousands of years considering alcohol a gift from the gods. This process is called fermentation, and it happens wherever there is sugar, yeast, and an absence of oxygen. In overripe fruit lying on the ground, in fruit juice left out for a few days, in grain soaked in water. Nature produces alcohol constantly, without anyone's involvement, simply because yeast exist, sugar exists, and they have nothing to breathe under the skin of a fallen piece of fruit. In 2004, biochemist Robert Dudley from the University of California, Berkeley published a paper in the Quarterly Review of Biology that became known as the drunk monkey hypothesis. The idea was this: over millions of years of evolution, primates who were able to find and eat overripe fruit with the smell of ethanol gained an evolutionary advantage because overripe fruit represents maximum sugar and calorie density, and the smell of ethanol was essentially a signal saying, food is here and there is plenty of it. Primates with an innate attraction to that smell ate better, survived better, and left more offspring. Which means our attraction to alcohol is not a character flaw, not a moral failing, and not a cultural habit. It is a 9-million-year-old evolutionary program written into us long before we became human. And that is why, when geneticists led by Matthew Hahn of Indiana University compared the genomes of humans and other primates in 2010, they found something remarkable. The ADH4 gene, responsible for breaking down ethanol in the body, underwent a significant mutation approximately 10 million years ago, precisely the period when our ancestors were beginning to descend from the trees and encountering overripe fruit on the ground with increasing frequency. That mutation made our bodies 40 times more efficient at processing ethanol compared to other primates. 40 times. We literally evolved to drink. But here is the paradox. Nobody planned to turn this into a beverage. The first human who intentionally made alcohol most likely simply forgot about some food. Left grain in water. Came back a few days later. Tasted what had happened. And felt exactly what that primate in the tropical forest felt millions of years before. Something had changed. According to research by Patrick McGovern of the University of Pennsylvania, published in PNAS in 2004, The earliest chemical traces of an alcoholic beverage were found in clay pots at Jiahu in northern China, approximately 9,000 years old. It was a mixture of fermented rice, millet, grapes, and honey. Not beer as we know it. Not wine. Something of its own, distinct, with no modern equivalent. But the key point is this. It was a drink that someone made deliberately. Someone knew that if you combined these ingredients and waited, something special would result. And that knowledge did not disappear. It spread, because within a few thousand years, alcohol was being brewed in Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, and South America, simultaneously, independently, in completely different cultures, from completely different ingredients. What does this tell us? Only one thing. Once humans discovered alcohol, they could never forget it. And in the next chapter, we will talk about why this discovery may have given birth to civilization itself, and why some archaeologists are still debating whether bread or beer came first. Chapter 2. Beer before bread. You think civilization began with farming, that humans learned to grow grain, and that changed everything. But what if it was the other way around? What if humans started growing grain not for food, but for something else entirely? Imagine an archaeologist holding a clay shard 10,000 years old and realizing that everything they were taught might be wrong. That is exactly what happened in 1953, when American anthropologist Robert Braidwood of the University of Chicago raised a question nobody had dared ask out loud before. What if agriculture emerged not to produce food, but to produce beer? Braidwood himself was not ready to accept the idea. He considered it absurd. But he was honest enough as a scientist to put it to debate in the American Anthropologist in 1953, and that question would haunt researchers for the next 70 years, because the facts kept pointing in the same direction. The earliest traces of grain cultivation appear not in river valleys where farming would be convenient, but on rocky hillsides where it required enormous effort and yielded minimal harvest. Why? Why would people who were living perfectly well as hunters and gatherers suddenly begin working so hard to cultivate land in the most inconvenient places imaginable? The answer proposed in the 1990s by biochemist and alcohol researcher Patrick McGovern of the Penn Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology sounds improbable, but is backed by chemical data. They were doing it for fermented drink. Not for bread. Bread can be baked from wild grain, which was plentiful enough in the Fertile Crescent. But for something that could only be obtained from cultivated grain, in large quantities, reliably, year after year. McGovern, in his book Uncorking the Past, published in 2009, describes in detail the chemical analysis of vessels from the earliest settlements of the Near East, and finds traces of fermentation again and again. Calcium oxalate characteristic of beer stone, residues of plant resins used to preserve the drink, traces of fruit acids. People were not simply drinking whatever happened to ferment by accident. They were producing alcohol deliberately, on an industrial scale, thousands of years before the first cities appeared. But this raises a question. Why did they need it so badly that they were willing to transform their entire way of life for it? And the answer is one of the most important in all of human history. Because alcohol did something that no other food product of the time could do. It made water safe. In a world without sewage systems, without any understanding of microbiology, without chlorine or filters, water killed. Rivers and water sources near human settlements were breeding grounds for cholera, dysentery, and typhoid fever. People died from water every day, and they did not understand why. But they noticed one thing. Those who drank fermented beverages got sick less often. This was not scientific knowledge. It was practical observation passed down through generations. And that observation was completely correct, because during fermentation, the alcohol and acids produced by yeast destroy most pathogenic microorganisms. Beer was safer than water. Literally. Tom Standage, in his book, A History of the World in 6 Glasses, published in 2005, puts it with devastating precision. Ancient Egyptians, Mesopotamians, and Greeks did not avoid water because they disliked it. They drank beer and wine because water killed them. Alcohol was not a pleasure, not a luxury, and not a vice. It was a means of survival. Now imagine Mesopotamia 4,000 years before the Common Era, the first cities in human history. Uruk, Eridu, Ur. Tens of thousands of people living together in a limited area, an unprecedented concentration of human beings for that time, and all of them drinking beer, not because there was nothing else to do, but because beer was the only way to supply that many people with safe liquid. Without beer, the first cities would have been impossible. Sumerian cuneiform tablets, deciphered in the 20th century, describe this with remarkable directness. Workers building ziggurats and irrigation canals received beer as their daily ration, not as a reward, as basic sustenance. The standard ration was between 1 and 3 liters of beer per day, depending on rank and physical exertion. Supervisors received more, laborers less. Beer was currency, calories and safe liquid all at once. And in Egypt, the situation was even more telling. Those same workers who built the pyramids, whom we for some reason still picture as slaves in chains, received, according to discovered papyri and ostraca, 4 to 5 liters of beer per day, plus bread, onions, and fish. Egyptologist Mark Lehner of Harvard University, who had been conducting excavations at the foot of Giza since 1984, discovered an entire industrial brewing complex next to the pyramid construction site, complete with fermentation vats, grain storage, and a distribution system. This was not a tavern. It was a state factory producing beer for the workforce. The scale of production allowed thousands of people to be supplied daily. The Egyptians knew recipes for more than 17 varieties of beer. Light, dark, sweet, with added dates, with added spices. They had a goddess of brewing, Ninkasi among the Sumerians, Tenamit among the Egyptians. They wrote hymns in honor of beer. The oldest surviving recipe in human history is not a recipe for bread, not for stew, and not for medicine. It is a recipe for beer, written on a Sumerian tablet around 1800 BCE and dedicated to the goddess Ninkasi. It begins with the words, "You are the one who soaks the malt in a jar," and then, verse by verse, describes the brewing process with such precision that modern brewers were able to reproduce the drink in 1989 as part of a project by the Anchor Brewing Company. Beer was so central to ancient cultures that its absence was perceived as catastrophe. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest literary works in human history, written down around 2100 BCE, the wild man Enkidu becomes civilized precisely after he drinks beer and eats bread. This is not an incidental detail. It is a symbol. Alcohol marks the boundary between wildness and civilization, between those who live like animals and those who live like human beings. And while the Sumerians and Egyptians were brewing their grain beer, something quite different was happening at the other end of the Mediterranean. Where the climate was warmer, where wild grapevines grew on hillsides, people were discovering a completely different drink. A drink that within a few centuries would become the symbol of civilization, the subject of philosophical debate, the center of religious ritual, and the cause of wars. And in the next chapter we will talk about how wine captured the gods, and what came of it. Chapter 3. The gods drink wine. Imagine that tomorrow scientists prove that everything your religion believes began with someone accidentally getting drunk. It sounds like an insult, but that is exactly what the data says. And that is exactly what we are going to talk about right now. There is a moment in history that historians describe in different ways. The axial age, the birth of civilization, the first flowering of culture, but which, on closer inspection, is united by one detail so obvious it is almost invisible. Everywhere the first great cultures emerge, in Greece, in Rome, across the Middle East, in Persia, at the very center of their religious, social, and political life stands the same drink, wine. Not beer, which everyone drank, and which was essentially food in liquid form. Wine, a drink that from the very beginning occupied a completely different place in the human hierarchy of meaning. And to understand why, we need to go back to where wine first appeared. The earliest traces of winemaking were discovered in 2017 by archaeologists in Georgia at the site of Shulaveri Gora. Residues of grape seeds, skins, and stems in large clay vessels called kvevri, approximately 8,000 years old, 1,000 years older than the previous record, which had been found in Iran. The study was published in PNAS in 2017 by a team led by Patrick McGovern, and it overturned existing assumptions about the geography of wine's origins. But more important than the question of where is the question of why. Why was wine perceived differently from the very beginning? Why did it immediately become the drink of gods, kings, and philosophers, rather than simply another way to make water safe? The answer lies in the nature of the grapevine itself. Grapes contain significantly more sugar than grain, which means wine produced through natural fermentation is stronger than ancient beer, around 10 to 12% alcohol compared to 3 to 5% for early beer. The effect of wine was more noticeable, faster, and, crucially, less predictable. A person who had drunk enough wine experienced something for which they had no rational explanation. The world changed. Fears disappeared. Thoughts and images arrived that had not been there before. For a person living in a world where every inexplicable phenomenon was attributed to the action of gods or spirits, the only logical conclusion was this: it is not the drink acting on you. It is a god entering you. This is precisely why, in virtually every culture where wine appeared, a god of wine appeared almost immediately alongside it. For the Greeks, this was Dionysus, arguably the strangest and most contradictory of the Olympian gods. Religious historian Karl Kerényi, in his monograph Dionysus: Archetypal Image of Indestructible Life, published in 1976, describes Dionysus as a god who literally embodied the dual nature of alcohol. On one side, ecstasy, creativity, liberation from social constraints, inspiration; on the other, madness, violence, loss of self, and death. The cult of Dionysus was the only Greek cult in which women played a central role. The Maenads, his followers, would go up into the mountains, drink wine, dance until exhausted, and, according to tradition, tear animals apart with their bare hands in a state of ecstasy. This is not metaphor and not artistic exaggeration. It is a description of a real religious ritual in which alcohol served as a tool for achieving an altered state of consciousness, what we would today call a trance or dissociation. But Dionysus was not only the god of madness, he was the god of theater. All the great Greek tragedies, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, were written and performed as part of the Dionysian festivals when the entire city drank wine and watched the stage. Classicist Richard Seaford of the University of Exeter, in his book Dionysus, published in 2006, makes a compelling case that Greek theater, one of the greatest cultural achievements in human history, was literally born from wine ritual. Without Dionysus, there would have been no Oedipus. Without wine, there would have been no tragedy as a genre. Alongside the Greek cult of Dionysus, Rome was developing the cult of Bacchus, his Roman equivalent. And here the story takes an unexpected turn. In 186 BCE, the Roman Senate issued a decree, the Senatus Consultum de Bacchanalibus, prohibiting Bacchic rituals across the entire territory of the Republic. This was one of the first legislative bans on religious practice in history, and the reason for it was precisely those effects that wine produced in combination with mass ritual consumption: violation of social norms, sexual license, political conspiracy, everything that happens when a large group of people systematically steps outside the control of reason with the help of alcohol. Rome banned Bacchic rituals, but at the same time was itself saturated with wine from top to bottom. The Roman Empire was literally built on vineyards. Wherever Roman legions went, the grapevine followed. France, Spain, Germany, Britain, everywhere Roman garrisons were stationed, soldiers planted vineyards, because wine was part of the military ration. Historian Hugh Johnson, in his landmark work, Vintage: The Story of Wine, published in 1989, calculated that a Roman legionary received approximately 1 liter of wine per day, diluted with water, which made it safe to drink while simultaneously purifying the water. The Roman army drank wine not for pleasure. It drank wine to survive. But at precisely this same moment, in that same Middle East where Christianity was taking shape, wine was acquiring an entirely different dimension. Jesus of Nazareth turns water into wine at a wedding in Cana. This is his first miracle according to the Gospel of John, written approximately between 90 and 110 CE. At the Last Supper, he takes a cup of wine and says, "This is my blood." From that moment, wine becomes literally sacred, not metaphorically, but in the most direct sense. In the Catholic tradition, the doctrine of transubstantiation, definitively formulated at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, holds that during the Eucharist, bread and wine physically become the body and blood of Christ. Alcohol becomes God. This is the most radical religious statement about alcohol in human history, and it remains the official doctrine of a church with more than 1 billion followers. But while Christianity was consecrating wine, a religion was being born at the other end of the Mediterranean that would say precisely the opposite about it. And that prohibition, total, absolute, binding on all, would become one of the most sweeping social experiments in human history. But before we get there, we need to talk about a 9th-century Arab alchemist who accidentally invented something that changed the very nature of alcohol. And in the next chapter, we will talk about how the concentration of ethanol leapt from 13% to 70%, and what that did to the world. Chapter 4. The Arabs invent strong alcohol. The most destructive drink in human history was invented by people whose religion forbade them to drink. This is not a twist of fate. It is a fact. And it says a great deal about the nature of human curiosity. Baghdad, 9th century CE. A city that at this moment is the intellectual capital of the world. The Abbasid Caliphate at the peak of its power. Here they are translating Aristotle, inventing algebra, developing the foundations of optics and medicine. In the famous House of Wisdom, Bait al-Hikmah, hundreds of scholars from across the known world are at work. And among them is Jabir ibn Hayyan, whom Europeans would later call Geber, a man whom many historians of science consider the father of chemistry. Jabir was not looking for a way to get drunk. He was looking for a way to understand the nature of matter. He was interested in what happens to substances when heated, why some substances transform into others, whether it was possible to extract from a complex substance its pure essence. It was precisely this idea, the idea of purification, of extracting the quintessence, that led him to a discovery he himself probably did not consider particularly significant. When Jabir heated fermented liquids in a special vessel called an alembic and collected the vapors that rose and condensed in a cooled tube, he obtained a liquid that burned with a blue flame and evaporated without leaving a trace. He called it al-kuhul, the finest powder, the quintessence, the purest form of matter. From this word came our word alcohol. Science historian Manfred Lechner of the University of Vienna, in his article The History of Distillation, published in the Journal of Chemical Education in 1991, describes in detail the Arabic manuscripts of the 9th and 10th centuries in which the first distillation experiments are recorded, and emphasizes a crucial point. Arab alchemists did not think of the distillate as a beverage. They thought of it as a medicine, a reagent, an instrument for understanding nature. The earliest distilled spirits were used medically, for disinfecting wounds, for preparing medicinal tinctures for anesthesia. Persian physician Avicenna, Ibn Sina, in his encyclopedic work, The Canon of Medicine, written around 1025, describes the use of distilled alcohol in surgical practice and emphasizes its antiseptic properties. This was 8 centuries before Louis Pasteur explained why antiseptics work. But knowledge of distillation could not remain in the hands of physicians. Through trade routes, through contact between the Muslim world and Christian Europe, above all through Spain, where Arab and European cultures were in closest contact, the technology of distillation made its way westward. And here, something happened that inevitably occurs when a powerful technology enters a different cultural context. Its application changed radically. European monks, primarily Benedictines and Cistercians, took the Arab alembic, set it up in monastery laboratories, and began distilling wine. What they obtained they called aqua vitae, water of life. It was believed to be a cure for all illnesses. Scots and Irish distilled grain mashes and called the result wishe bitha, also water of life in Gaelic, the phrase from which the word whiskey derives. The French distilled wine and obtained brandy, from the Dutch brandewijn, meaning burnt wine. The Dutch added juniper and obtained genever, the ancestor of gin. And everywhere, without exception, the first use of distillates was medicinal. Historian Andrew Watt, in his book Spirit: A History of Distillation, published in 2004, traces this path with remarkable detail. Every new distillate appeared first in the pharmacy, then in the tavern. First as medicine, then as pleasure. First on a physician's prescription, then by personal desire. The fundamental difference between distillates and fermented drinks came down to one number. Fermentation stops naturally at an ethanol concentration of around 13%. When the alcohol becomes toxic to the yeast themselves, they die and the process ceases. This is a biological limit. Distillation knows no such limit. Technically, almost pure ethanol can be obtained, 96%. In practice, the strong distillates of that era contained between 40 and 60% alcohol. That is 4 to 5 times stronger than wine. This changed everything. Because the effect arrived faster, was more intense and, crucially, significantly harder to control. A person accustomed to managing their state with wine was completely unprepared for what a glass of brandy did to them. But there was another reason why strong alcohol spread so rapidly, and it was entirely practical. Distillates did not spoil. Wine turned to vinegar within a few weeks, beer within a few days. Strong spirits, properly stored, could last for years. This made them ideal goods for long-distance trade. And it was precisely this quality that would transform alcohol over the next 2 centuries into one of the primary instruments of empire building. Because when European ships began crossing oceans in search of new trade routes and new lands, the hold of every one of them contained barrels of distillate, and those barrels would play a role that the captains almost certainly never anticipated. In the next chapter, we will talk about how alcohol became the fuel of the age of exploration, and what price was paid by those who never asked to be discovered. Chapter 5. Alcohol builds and destroys empires. There are things that history textbooks call great discoveries: Vasco da Gama, Columbus, Magellan. But nobody talks about what was in the holds of their ships, and what there was something without which those voyages would have been simply impossible, and something that turned the discovery of new lands into one of the greatest catastrophes in human history. Lisbon, 1497. Vasco da Gama is preparing 4 ships for the voyage around Africa to India. The journey will take more than a year. On board, 170 men. The main problem is not navigation, and not storms. The main problem is that fresh water in wooden barrels turns foul within a few weeks. Already a month into the open ocean, the crew will be drinking water that can kill them. The solution that every captain of the time knew was simple and proven. Add some brandy or wine to the water barrel. Alcohol killed bacteria and extended the shelf life of water several times over. This was not a pleasure or a privilege. It was survival technology in the open ocean. Historian Lawrence Pringle, in his study Alcohol, Drink or Drug, published in 1986, calculated that the standard ration of a sailor on a European ship during the age of exploration included approximately 1 liter of wine, or an equivalent amount of a stronger drink per day. Not because captains wanted to keep their crews in a mild state of intoxication, but because it was the only reliable way to provide the crew with safe liquid over the course of a months-long voyage. Without alcohol, there would have been no Vasco da Gama. Without alcohol, there would have been no Columbus. Without alcohol, there would have been none of the transoceanic voyages that changed the map of the world. This is not an exaggeration. It is physiology and microbiology that the sailors of the time did not understand, but were applying correctly by instinct. But alcohol in the holds of ships during the age of exploration played not only the role of preservative, it played the role of currency. And this is where the story becomes significantly darker. Because when European ships reached the coasts of Africa, Asia, and the Americas, barrels of distillate became trade goods, and those goods were used to purchase things that today we can only call crimes against humanity. The triangular trade, one of the most monstrous mechanisms in human history, worked as follows. European ships carried goods from Europe to West Africa, textiles, weapons, metals, and alcohol, primarily gin and brandy. These goods were exchanged for people, Africans who had been captured or sold into slavery. Then the ships with their human cargo crossed the Atlantic. This route was called the Middle Passage, and delivered the enslaved people to plantations in the Caribbean and the American South. There the ships were loaded with sugar, cotton, tobacco, and rum, the products of plantation labor, and returned to Europe. The circle closed. Rum occupied a special place in this system. It was produced from molasses, a byproduct of sugar production, right on the Caribbean plantations, and it was so cheap to produce that it became the primary currency of the slave trade. Historian Elizabeth Abbott, in her book Sugar: A Bittersweet History, published in 2009, documents the scale of this. British slave traders alone, between 1650 and 1807, transported more than 3 million people out of Africa, and a significant proportion of those transactions involved alcohol as the means of payment. Alcohol did not merely accompany the slave trade, it financed it. African chiefs and merchants who received European gin and brandy quickly discovered that strong distillates produced a completely different effect from traditional local fermented drinks, palm wine or banana beer. The effect was stronger, arrived faster, and led to dependency significantly more quickly. Economist Nathan Nunn of Harvard University, in his paper, The Long-Term Effects of Africa's Slave Trade, published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics in 2008, shows that regions of Africa most heavily involved in the slave trade demonstrate persistent economic and social problems to this day, and that the deliberate use of alcohol to destabilize local societies and facilitate the capture of people was a documented practice among slave traders. Parallel to the African tragedy, an American one was unfolding. As European settlers pushed deeper into North America, strong alcohol became one of the primary instruments in their dealings with indigenous peoples. Historian Peter Mancall, in his study Deadly Medicine: Indians and Alcohol in Early America, published in 1995, documents the systematic use of alcohol as a tool of negotiation, manipulation, and displacement. Treaties for the sale of land were signed in the course of shared whiskey drinking, debts for alcohol were used to coerce concessions, and the dependency that developed in certain communities destroyed traditional social structures faster than any other weapon. It is important to understand, the vulnerability of indigenous Americans to alcohol was not genetic predetermination. That is a myth unsupported by modern genetics. It was a consequence of the absence of cultural norms around consumption that had been forming in European societies over millennia, combined with the deliberate use of alcohol as a weapon by those who possessed those norms. But while alcohol was destroying some societies, it was building others. Rum produced on Caribbean plantations became the primary export commodity of the British colonies in North America before cotton or tobacco had even appeared there. Historian John J. McCusker, in his paper Rum and the American Revolution, published in the William and Mary Quarterly in 1979, argues that British attempts to restrict rum production in the colonies through the Molasses Act of 1733 and subsequent trade restrictions became one of the economic triggers that ultimately led to the American Revolution of 1776. American independence and rum, not the most obvious connection, but the data speaks for itself. By the end of the 18th century, alcohol had transformed from a drink into a structural element of the global economy. It financed empires, carved out trade routes, and served simultaneously as weapon and currency. And it was precisely at this moment, when its role in human life had reached its peak, that something nobody had anticipated began to happen. Cities with millions of inhabitants began to drown in alcohol, literally. And in the next chapter, we will talk about how one drink nearly destroyed the largest city in the world, and what came of it. Chapter 6. When a City Lost Its Mind, 1720. London, the largest city in the world. And it is slowly dying. Not from plague, not from war, not from famine. From a drink that costs less than bread and is sold on every corner. What happens in London over the next 30 years will become the first large-scale study in history of what alcohol does to an entire society. And we have not learned its lessons yet. To understand the gin crisis, you need to understand London at the beginning of the 18th century. This is a city growing faster than it can handle the consequences of that growth. In 1700, the population of London stands at around 500,000. By 1750, it will have grown to 700,000. People arrive from the countryside looking for work, discover that work exists but is exhausting, pays little, and offers no prospects. They live in slums, in rented rooms where 4 people share a single bed. The rate of child mortality is catastrophic. According to the London Bills of Mortality, in some years during the first half of the 18th century, more than 75% of children died before reaching the age of 5. Into this city comes gin. Not an English invention, a Dutch distillate brought to England along with King William III of Orange in 1689. At first, it is a middle-class drink, relatively expensive and not accessible to everyone. But in 1690, the English Parliament makes a decision whose consequences nobody calculated. In order to support domestic grain production and undercut French imports of brandy and wine, Parliament abolishes the licensing requirements for the production of grain distillates. From now on, anyone can distill gin without a license, without permission, without any oversight whatsoever. Historian Patrick Dillon, in his book Gin, The Much-Lamented Death of Madame Geneva, published in 2003, describes what happened next as the first drug epidemic in history within an urban environment. Within a few years, the number of gin outlets in London grew from a few hundred to more than 7,000. By some estimates, by the 1730s, there was 1 gin outlet for every 5 London households. It was sold in cellars, on streets, in barber shops, in prisons, literally everywhere. Its price had fallen so far that a glass of gin cost less than a loaf of bread. The famous sign that some vendors displayed, "Drunk for a penny, dead drunk for 2pence, clean straw for nothing," was not advertising exaggeration. It was a literal description of the service on offer. London society split into 2 halves. The wealthy drank port and claret in the clubs of St. James's. The poor drank gin in the slums of St. Giles. And they drank it not the way one drinks wine or beer, in small amounts, slowly, savoring it. Gin was drunk in one go, in large quantities and quickly, because that was precisely how it worked best as anesthesia against an unbearable reality. Demographer John Landers of the London School of Economics, in his study Death and the Metropolis, Studies in the Demographic History of London 1670 to 1830, published in 1993, conducted a statistical analysis of the London Bills of Mortality for the period between 1700 and 1750, and found a direct correlation between rising gin consumption and rising mortality in the poorest parishes of the city. In the peak years, from 1720 to 1750, mortality in London consistently exceeded the birth rate. The city was literally dying out. It was precisely during this period that the artist William Hogarth created 2 prints that would become among the most famous works of 18th century British art: Beer Street and Gin Lane, published in 1751. In Beer Street, prosperous, healthy, cheerful people building houses and going about their business. In Gin Lane, destruction, death, a mother dropping her child, a man selling his tools for the next drink. Hogarth was not a moralist, he was a documentarian. What he depicted was a literal description of what was happening a few streets from his studio. Parliament attempted to solve the problem through legislation several times. The Gin Act of 1729 introduced licensing and taxes. Without success, illegal production flourished. The Act of 1736 set taxes so high that legal trade virtually ceased, but illegal trade only grew. In the streets, the new law was nicknamed Mother Gin, and people held a public funeral for it, complete with a coffin and a mourning procession. Only the Gin Act of 1751, the same year Hogarth published his prints, began to produce results. It restricted the sale of gin in retail shops and pharmacies, required the licensing of taverns, and introduced a system of oversight. Historian Jessica Warner, in her book Craze, Gin, and Debauchery in an Age of Reason, published in 2002, analyses why this particular act succeeded where the previous ones had failed. It did not ban gin. It regulated the conditions of its sale. This is a subtle but fundamental distinction. Prohibition does not work. Regulation does. Humanity would learn this lesson one more time, and in a significantly more painful way, 2 centuries later, on the other side of the Atlantic. Because in 1920 the United States of America decided to do what the British Parliament had failed to do in 1736, ban alcohol entirely. The 18th Amendment to the Constitution, which came into force on January 17, 1920, prohibited the production, transportation, and sale of alcoholic beverages across the entire territory of the country. This was the largest social experiment in the history of a democratic state, and it failed so completely and so instructively that its results are still studied in law schools and political science programs around the world. Historian Daniel Ockrent, in his book Last Call: The Rise and Fall of Prohibition, published in 2010, reconstructs the picture of prohibition with documentary precision. Alcohol consumption did genuinely fall in the early years, by approximately 30%, but by the mid-1920s it had begun to recover, and to recover in its most dangerous forms. Moonshine brewed in unsanitary conditions from whatever materials were available frequently contained methanol, wood alcohol, which causes blindness and death. According to historians' estimates, between 10 and 50,000 Americans died from poisoning by surrogate alcohol during Prohibition. No official figures exist. The government was not collecting them. At the same time, organized crime was flourishing. Al Capone in Chicago, Lucky Luciano in New York, Bugsy Siegel in Los Angeles, all of them built their fortunes and created their organizations precisely through the underground trade in alcohol. Prohibition did not remove alcohol from the streets. It handed control of the alcohol market to criminal structures and funded the creation of the American mafia in the form in which it would exist throughout the 20th century. On December 5, 1933, the 21st Amendment to the Constitution repealed the 18th. Prohibition was over. 13 years, tens of thousands of deaths, the flourishing of organized crime, and the complete discrediting of legislative prohibition as an instrument for combating alcoholism. What remained from that experience was one very clear conclusion, which sociologist Harry J. Anslinger, ironically, one of the chief architects of American prohibition policy, was never able to accept. The problem is not the availability of the substance. The problem is why people want to escape from reality in the first place. And it is precisely that question, why, that brings us to the final and perhaps most important part of our story. Because everything we have discussed so far is the story from the outside. The story of politics, economics, religion, and war. But there is also the story from the inside, the story of what alcohol does to the brain, and why 1 billion people on this planet cannot stop, even when they desperately want to. And in the next chapter, we will go to where all the real decisions are made, into the neuroscience of addiction. Chapter 7. What alcohol does to the brain. Every year, millions of people around the world make the same decision. They tell themselves, "That's it, enough, I'm stopping." And most of them don't stop. Not because they are weak, not because they lack willpower, but because by the time they make that decision, their brain is no longer entirely their own. Let's start with a basic question that most people cannot answer precisely. What does alcohol do to the brain in the first few minutes after consumption? Not in the long term, but right now, in real time, while you are holding a glass in your hand. The answer is more complex than it seems, and it is precisely that complexity that explains why alcohol is so resistant to simple prohibitions and moral condemnation. Ethanol is a small molecule that dissolves well in both water and fat. This means it passes easily through the blood-brain barrier, the protective filter that prevents most substances from moving from the bloodstream into the brain. Most drugs force their way through this barrier with difficulty. Ethanol passes freely, and once it reaches the brain, it begins working on several levels simultaneously. Neuroscientist Howard Fields of the University of California, San Francisco, in his review paper, The Neuroscience of Alcohol Reward, published in Neuropharmacology in 2007, describes three primary mechanisms by which ethanol acts on neural systems. The first is the enhancement of GABA receptor activity. GABA, gamma-aminobutyric acid, is the brain's primary inhibitory neurotransmitter. When alcohol amplifies its action, the activity of many brain structures decreases, above all the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for impulse control, risk assessment, and long-term planning. This is precisely why a person who has been drinking becomes less cautious, more talkative, and prone to actions that they would never take sober. It is not a loss of self. It is the temporary switching off of that part of the self that says, wait, think, stop. The second mechanism is the blocking of glutamate receptors. Glutamate is the brain's primary excitatory neurotransmitter. When alcohol blocks its receptors, the speed of signal transmission between neurons slows. This is what causes slurred speech, impaired coordination, and memory loss, everything we see in a drunk person from the outside, which they themselves experience as everything has become a little softer. The third mechanism is the most important for understanding addiction. Alcohol stimulates the release of dopamine in the nucleus accumbens, a brain structure that neuroscientists call the reward center. Dopamine is not a pleasure hormone, as popular literature tends to describe it. It is more accurately described as a hormone of anticipation and motivation. It tells the brain, this is important, remember this, do this again. Dopamine is what makes us want to repeat an experience. Any experience the brain has marked as significant. Nora Volkow, director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse in the United States since 2003, in a series of studies published in JAMA Psychiatry between 2007 and 2015, used positron emission tomography to show that the dopamine system of people with alcohol dependency functions in a fundamentally different way from that of people without dependency. The number of dopamine receptors in dependent individuals is reduced. The brain has literally decreased the number of sockets into which dopamine plugs in response to its constant excessive stimulation by alcohol. This means that to achieve the same sense of satisfaction, they need more alcohol. And more. And more. This is not a character flaw. This is neuroadaptation, a physiological process as real and measurable as elevated blood pressure or a change in blood sugar levels. But addiction is not only about dopamine, it is also about memory. Researcher Terry Robinson of the University of Michigan, together with Kent Berridge, developed a theory in 1993 that they called incentive salience, published in Brain Research Reviews in 1993. According to this theory, the brain of a dependent person separates wanting and liking into two independent processes. A person may take no pleasure from alcohol, they may even despise what it does to them, but still experience an irresistible desire to drink, because the wanting system in their brain continues to operate even when the liking system has long since stopped sending a signal of pleasure. This is precisely why an alcoholic who says, "I want to stop but I can't," is not lying and is not making excuses. They are describing a real neurobiological state in which two parts of their brain want opposite things. But why do some people become dependent while others do not? This is a question researchers have been asking for decades, and the answer turned out to be far more complex than early theories assumed. Psychiatrist Mark Schuckett of the University of California, San Diego, in a large-scale longitudinal study begun in 1978 and continuing for more than 25 years, with results published in the American Journal of Psychiatry throughout the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s, tracked the lives of several hundred young men, some of whom had a family history of alcoholism and some of whom did not. His central finding was counterintuitive. People with a hereditary predisposition to alcoholism felt a less pronounced effect from alcohol, not a stronger one, as might have been assumed. They needed to drink more to feel what other people felt from a smaller amount. At first glance, this sounds like an advantage. In reality, it is a trap. A person who needs more alcohol to achieve an effect drinks more from the very beginning, and their brain adapts to high doses faster, demanding ever greater quantities. Genetics accounts for approximately 50% of the risk of developing alcohol dependency. The remaining 50% is environment, trauma, stress, and availability. This means that alcoholism is never entirely a genetic destiny, and never entirely the result of personal choice. It always exists at the intersection of biology and biography. Neuroscientist George Koob, director of the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism in the United States since 2014, in his book Neurobiology of Alcohol Dependence, co-written with Michel Lemoyle and published in 2006, describes alcohol dependency as a chronic relapsing brain disease, and insists that this definition has not only medical but ethical significance. If dependency is a disease rather than a vice, then our entire approach to people with dependency must be reconsidered. This does not mean removing responsibility. A sick person still bears responsibility for their actions. But it means that condemnation and moral pressure as therapeutic instruments do not work and never have. The data confirms this with devastating clarity. Programs based on shame and judgment show significantly worse outcomes than programs based on medical support and changes to the social environment. According to data published by the World Health Organization in the Global Status Report on Alcohol and Health in 2018, alcohol is responsible for more than 3 million deaths per year, 5% of all global mortality. It is among the 7 leading risk factors for the global burden of disease, and yet it remains legal, widely available, and socially accepted in virtually every culture that does not explicitly prohibit it. This contradiction between what we know about alcohol and how we treat it is perhaps the most eloquent evidence of how deeply this drink is embedded in human nature. Not in culture, in nature. In those very neural circuits that formed over millions of years of evolution in primates feeding on overripe fruit in tropical forests. And it is precisely about this, about what all of this means, that we will talk in the final chapter. Because the history of alcohol is not the history of a drink. It is a history of who we are and of what we do with that. Chapter 8, The Mirror. We began this story with a primate in a tropical forest, 9 million years ago. One fallen piece of fruit, one bite, and a chain of events that led to wars, empires, religions, revolutions, and 3 million deaths a year. But here is the question I want to leave you with. If that primate had known what would follow, would it have eaten the fruit anyway? There is a particular mode of historical thinking that philosophers call counterfactual, imagining what would have happened if a key event had not occurred. What if Napoleon had not lost at Waterloo? What if Hitler had been accepted into the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts? What if Columbus had never reached America? It is an intellectual game with no correct answers, but one that reveals just how significant a given event truly was. Let us apply this method to alcohol. Imagine a world without fermentation, a world in which yeast, for some reason, do not produce ethanol. What do we lose? We lose the first cities of Mesopotamia, Because without safe drinking liquid, tens of thousands of people could not live together in a confined area. We lose the pyramids because the workers who built them received beer as part of their ration, and without that ration the work would have been impossible. We lose Greek theater, born from Dionysian ritual, at the center of which was wine. We lose the Christian sacrament of the Eucharist in the form in which it exists, because "this is my blood" was said of wine. We lose the age of exploration, because without alcohol as a water preservative, transoceanic voyages were technically impossible. We lose, possibly, the very idea of agriculture, if McGovern's hypothesis is correct, and grain was first cultivated for beer rather than for bread. This does not mean that alcohol created civilization single-handedly. It means that alcohol was embedded in civilization's foundations so deeply that separating one from the other is practically impossible. Anthropologist David Christian of Macquarie University, author of the concept of Big History and the book Maps of Time, An Introduction to Big History, published in 2004, describes civilization as a series of accidental discoveries, each of which created the conditions for the next. Alcohol is one of those discoveries. Not planned, not intended for the purposes it ultimately served. Simply an accident that found itself in the right place at the right time, and which the human brain, tuned by evolution to seek out ethanol, immediately recognized as something important. But here arises the question that has been nagging since the very beginning of this story. If alcohol is so deeply embedded in human nature and human history, why does it kill 3 million people a year? Why does a drink that helped build the first cities now destroy millions of lives? The answer I want to offer is not a final one, but it seems to me the most honest. Alcohol has not changed. The conditions have changed. 9 million years of evolution tuned us to seek and consume ethanol in a natural environment where the maximum concentration of alcohol in an overripe piece of fruit is around 1 to 2%. Thousands of years of history added fermented drinks, with concentrations of 3 to 13%. A few centuries ago, distillation created drinks with concentrations of 40 to 70%. Our brains evolved for the first. Our culture created the third. And the gap between what we were built for and what we now encounter, that gap is the source of most of the human suffering connected to alcohol. Writer and historian Mark Forsyth, in his book A Short History of Drunkenness, published in 2017, ends his investigation with an observation that strikes me as the most precise thing I have read about alcohol. Every era gets the alcohol problem it deserves. The ancient Egyptians, drinking weak grain beer in moderate quantities, did not know mass alcoholism. The London poor of the 18th century, given access to cheap, strong gin without any cultural norms for its consumption, got an epidemic. The Americans of the 20th century, who tried to prohibit what cannot be prohibited, got organized crime and surrogate alcohol. Our era, an era of globally available strong drinks, aggressive advertising by alcohol brands, the chronic stress of modern life and the destruction of the traditional social structures that historically regulated consumption, gets its own problem. 3 million deaths a year. This is not a verdict and not an inevitability. It is the consequence of specific conditions that people have created, and that people can change. Finnish researcher Pekka Sulkkonen of the University of Helsinki, in his monograph, The Lifestyle Society, Consumption, Production, and Entrepreneurship, published in 1992, proposed a concept that explains the human relationship with alcohol more precisely than any other. Alcohol is a mirror. It reflects not what a person wants to be, but what they actually are. What a person seeks in an altered state of consciousness, relief from unbearable stress, the courage for a conversation impossible sober, oblivion from pain that cannot be endured, or simply the joy of a world that for a few hours has become a little softer and a little kinder. All of this says more about that person than any questionnaire or psychological test. And this is precisely why prohibition does not work. You cannot ban a mirror. You can only change what is reflected in it. You can create a world with less unbearable stress. You can build a culture in which people are able to speak sober about the things they are afraid to say. You can create social structures that give people belonging and meaning without requiring them to search for those things at the bottom of a bottle. This is not naive optimism. This is what the data shows. Countries with high levels of social trust, low inequality, and strong systems of psychological support demonstrate significantly fewer alcohol-related problems than countries lacking these things, even at comparable levels of consumption. Researcher Tim Stockwell of the University of Victoria, in a meta-analysis, Social Determinants of Alcohol Use Disorders, published in The Lancet in 2016, shows that the level of inequality in a society is a more accurate predictor of alcohol problems than the level of consumption itself. People do not drink because alcohol is available. People drink because they need somewhere to put what is happening inside them. And at the end of this story, a story that began with a primate in a tropical forest and passed through the first cities, Greek gods, Arab alchemists, the slave trade, London slums, and American prohibition, I want to return to that very beginning, to the fallen fruit, to the smell that stopped the primate, to the first bite. That creature did not know what it was doing. It was simply following what evolution had built it to do, seeking calories, following a scent, trying something new, and it accidentally discovered a substance that millions of years later would be simultaneously the building material of civilization and one of its greatest threats. We inherited both, and the choice of what exactly that inheritance becomes in our hands, that is the only thing that remains entirely up to us.